In signing a letter to the record, in March 2020, all 4 members of the name group clearly agreed to
expect to receive criticism and challenge of the work we do.
They also added a caveat.
But the right to criticize and challenge does not extend to the right to personally attack us as individuals.
The name group appeared to be ready to take on challenge of their work, but not their personal behavior. This declaration of separation of work from person, the objectifying of work as being unrelated to personal attributes like personally held values and behaviours, was subsequently contradicted by a comment from Mandisa in the wake of the unsuccessful witch hunt following a leak from RCVS.
As council members of our profession's regulatory body, we must maintain the very highest standards of probity and integrity if we are to maintain the trust and confidence of our professional colleagues. In the same way, we must subject ourselves to the same level of scrutiny and investigation if these values and behaviours are ever called into question.
In other words, Mandisa qualified the expectation of challenge of their work not to be personalized, with a correction that their values and behaviors as council members could reasonably include personal scrutiny and investigation, precisely in order to maintain the trust and confidence of professional colleagues. This series of explainer videos elucidates the appearance of a lifestyle political agenda at RCVS from 2017, which is explicitly linked to the protagonists of the name group, who have had their personal values and behaviors recorded again and again by and on the RCVS public platform, a claim articulated by Amanda in her own words.
One thing, as RCVS president, you do is have a platform.
Mandisa's comments clearly open up a path to discussing the role and responsibility of the name group as individuals for the intersectional politics that prevails at RCVS. The path has been opened by Mandisa, and the justifications for examining the individuals has been stated already, that none of the name group have admitted to creating this political dimension at RCVS, and none of them, elected or appointed, received a remit from the profession to do so. They did this on their own cognizance. It is not possible to divine their motivation for creating a political RCVS. But we can recognize and elaborate on their values and behaviors, scrutinizing their words and actions, and, to go back to the letter that all of the name group signed, take them at their word when they agreed to
welcome challenge and debate.
So, please use the facility this format provides to comment and create the debate that the RCVS and name group have not, as yet, engaged with.
Neil Connell. Neil is a man of convictions and contradictions. In his election manifesto 2015, he wrote,
I want to hear how vets see their profession evolving in the future, and what their hopes are, and responses to members' communications and concerns must be even better and faster, with no room for complacency.
This was terrific, vote-winning stuff, but by 2019, his message had changed, from one of willingness to listen, to one of commitment, to changing the culture of the profession. However, at no time in the council election process, did he mention his commitment to the emerging politics at RCVS, and his role in promoting intersectionality, as the mechanism for culture change, in the profession. For that, we need to look a little further afield. In a magazine article, published in September 2019, he said,
I had privilege. I am white. I was a man.
This was his first reference to his own identitarian viewpoint, followed by a signal that RCVS was interpreting the profession along intersectional lines, as well.
RCVS has been aware for a while about the lack of diversity within our professions, including regarding ethnicity, socio-economic background, physical ability, and gender, among other areas. However, it is not enough to increase the diversity of those entering the profession. Work must be done. Also, to ensure that everyone working within our professions has a good quality experience in their working lives, without fear of, or the actuality of, discrimination, harassment, or abuse.
This was virtue signaling, and political posturing, making no concession to the relevance of competence. Furthermore, his polemic failed to acknowledge that law already existed to prohibit discrimination, harassment, and abuse, along the dimensions of the protected characteristics. No reasonable person would object to his words, because that debate had been had already by society in general. His rhetoric, at this time, was purely political. Later in the same piece, he went on to contradict himself, falling foul of one of the essentially irreconcilable inconsistencies of intersectional politics.
I've also heard middle-aged married heterosexual men do not appreciate they might have enjoyed some privileges to get to where they are. Others have had to work harder for equal consideration because they face additional battles and obstacles in society.
In this interview he selected a minority group within our professions, that is men, and marginalized them, discounting their viewpoint and achievements, because they do not have levels of handicap endured by unidentified others. He then went on to use a rhetorical sleight of hand, favored by intersectionalists, by declaring that his demand for middle-aged, married, heterosexual men to check their privilege was not a slur. Requiring professional colleagues to check their male privilege can never be construed as anything other than a slur, and insult, and virtue signaling to others, who buy into the lifestyle politics of intersectionality, led by this president of RCVS. Targeting a group with a crime, without looking at the specifics of person and situation, is reprehensible, unless your political outlook, your doctrine, has given you license to articulate this, without remorse. Why is his idea of guilt, of a collective held at an individual level, a reasonable thing for him to demand? It should also be pointed out, that his so-called privilege argument, has nothing to do with the delivery of our science in clinical practice, or the advancement of animal welfare, the two undisputed axioms of our profession. Once Neil's politics, and his commitment to the epistemology of intersectionality are understood, a perspective can be taken of his work at RCVS. We shall take just 3 examples. Firstly, in January 2020, he proudly announced that staff at RCVS would receive mandatory diversity training, and if possible, counselors as well. Setting aside the lack of evidence for the effectiveness of this training, it was still an authoritarian attempt to change the way staff and counselors were thinking, speaking, and behaving. There is a perfectly good word in the English language for this activity, and that word is indoctrination. The history of the use of indoctrination is not positive, and is always associated with an authoritarian mindset. Why would we want an authoritarian, doctrinal, RCVS, and why would that be a good thing, particularly when we haven't been invited to discuss, or agree to this approach? Secondly, during his presidential year, an allocation of funds, from the Sarah Brown Mental Health Grant Fund was made to 2 projects. One was being undertaken by veterinary surgeons, and non-clinical researchers, to look at the impact of racism, and discrimination, in our profession, and how RCVS might counter this. The memory of Sarah Brown, and, by extension, all those lost to the profession from suicide, was being linked, used, debased, by association with a political agenda, and money was being awarded to those who had no qualification in human clinical practice, and who came from a manifestly interested background. The rhetoric of racism, of discrimination, is not that of any clinical practice. It is not even close to the problems that lead to the profession's history of severe mental illness, and suicide. These terms come from the lexicon of politics, particularly identity politics. RCVS was funding an agenda, driven by identity politics, and using our suicides to elevate it to some sort of equivalence of seriousness. Why is that conscionable, and doesn't it show a staggering distortion of a moral compass? In bringing this facet of Neil's presidency up, no one is condoning the abhorrent problems of racism and discrimination. No one, in society in general, should be subject to racism. This relates to Neil's presidency demonstrating utter crassness and insensitivity, whilst playing well to his identitarian agenda, and showing an obvious distortion of moral equivalence. And, when, exactly, were we, in the profession, allowed to debate these politically driven funding decisions? Neil is also chairman of the DIG, at RCVS, and has endorsed this statement of intent.
We need diverse and inclusive veterinary professions. Bias, discrimination, and harassment exists within our professions. We need to identify it, reject it, and change our culture for the better.
Neil's facilitation of an intersectional agenda, and of identitarian politics at RCVS is beyond doubt. But, the same questions posed by these explainer videos remain extant. When were we asked about this, and what does it do to advance our science and animal welfare?
Amanda Bogue. Amanda Bogue is a veterinary surgeon who has no experience of general practice. She has been an academic, an occasional clinical vet in a niche specialty, and a manager. She has not experienced ownership in practice. She has not experienced long-term, as in decades, of team working and client service. She has not experienced delivering a lifetime of care to any patient, as we do, every day, in frontline clinical practice. Like Niall Connell, her RCVS Council election manifesto, in 2016, was a populist vehicle for re-election, and also completely failed to mention her political agenda. She wrote,
"With my diverse background, in both the academic and commercial worlds, if re-elected, over the next 4 years, I will work to ensure the positive developments in governance and communication continue."
But, during her term as president, she helped Niall and Elizabeth to create the Overton window acceptable within RCVS, with a version of intersectional politics focusing primarily on sex and structural racism, and gave us an account of this in a conversation recorded by RCVS. In her own words,
"Those of us, in positions that can influence, need to be taking a strong lead on trying to address some of those more structural issues. In terms of the structures that exist regarding race, it's not enough just to say active discrimination is illegal. I see a problem or a challenge, and I want to try and be part of fixing it, a solution. Unless we're happy that the gender and race proportions in our profession and in leadership roles is right, and does reflect everyone having the same opportunity, then that might be a view some people hold. It's not a view that I hold. So I want to do something about it."
She also showed herself incapable of understanding that her political statements were inherently inconsistent. Thus, once again, in her own words,
"I think it does come back to that really core belief I have, that everybody, regardless of gender, ethnicity, socioeconomic background, should have an equal opportunity to have the life that they want to lead."
Which was then followed by an exposition of what she really meant, the entirely different concept of equity of outcome.
"So, I kind of thought, well, actually, despite all of the change in society, it isn't a level playing field. If it were, then things would be more evenly distributed, I guess. People would be more evenly distributed, I should say."
In other words, that there would be an equity of outcome. This should have given her pause to understand the cognitive dissonance at play here in her own words. Instead, she took the opportunity that her presidential platform gave her to denounce racists in the profession, relying on anecdotes supplied by the behaviours. Where was her admission of commitment to intersectional politics in her election manifesto, and where was the opportunity for members to debate her use of the presidential platform? Furthermore, as a co-signatory of the letter to the record, allegedly agreeing to accept challenge and debate, where was that invitation to challenge and debate during her presidency? And once again, how exactly does her intersectional politics enhance our science and commitment to improving animal welfare? Mandisa Green. Mandisa Green is a veterinary surgeon who has little experience of any aspect of veterinary practice. She has worked for short periods in practice, moving to locum and out-of-hours work, missing out on general experience, team working, ownership responsibility, and, until now, real-life management responsibility. She became president of RCVS, just like all other presidents, through the RCVS system, which does not involve popular election beyond council. There is no meritocratic element to becoming president of RCVS, something worth mentioning, so as not to confuse her presidency with anything special, based on her immutable characteristics. She is, no less, or more, than any of us. She is just a veterinary surgeon, blessed with inexperience. Her presidency, unfortunately for the profession, coincided with COVID restrictions, which effectively handicapped her term, and so it is possible we did not see the best of what she could have brought to our world. However, her year did see one of the most authoritarian and controlling episodes yet seen at RCVS. The witch hunt into the so-called leak of confidential information harked back to the RCVS behaviour in the 2000s and was revealing, on any number of levels. Firstly, the idea that the profession could not consider the matter of a change in the type of proof required for disciplinary conviction in a mature fashion was beyond condescending. Secondly, in the appeal to the whistleblower to come forward, which incidentally went unheeded, the idea that anyone would believe that RCVS would treat a whistleblower reasonably was laughable, given its shift from no-blame culture to a political stance of guilt based on immutable characteristics. And thirdly, even though the investigation failed to find the whistleblower, the chilling effect of knowing that there is now a precedent set for private investigators to be called to scrutinize personal behaviors when on council is a method for collective control, because no boundaries or protocols have been set for the investigatory process, or how any other information, which might come to light coincidentally, would be handled, and by whom. The price for personal conscience, at council, is now quite clear. If you object, you must resign, thereby also sending a message to all those in the profession who elected the councillor who, in all conscience, could not support the RCVS line. The price for speaking out is now too high, just consequent upon the implementation of this investigation, never mind the outcome. Mandisa, with all her inexperience, did not resist this. Instead, she gave this authoritarian turn her presidential imprimatur. Mandisa, like Amanda, is also capable of ignoring what should be a cognitive dissonance for her, in respect of equality of opportunity versus equity of outcome. To use just two examples from her own words, once more platformed by RCVS, and heavily related to her own admission of inexperience.
So, it's really that it's trying to not just give people opportunities, but give them the opportunities and tools so that they could succeed.
This is an articulation of wanting equal opportunity, undermined, in the same statement, by.
It's simply for people to be able to understand that sometimes you need to shift over.
And.
It is moving aside, so that someone can get into that role.
And.
So for me, it is about making room, with men and women, all white.
In other words, she was really calling for an equity of outcome, not a process based on equal, competitive opportunity, valuing experience and competence, but a contrived, controlled outcome instead, particularly defined by racial characteristics. In a blog post on the RCVS platform, Mandisa went much further, authoring a piece introduced as using intersectional politics.
In the latest of our blogs from the RCVS officer team, RCVS Senior Vice President Mandisa Green talks about some of the challenges she faced as a woman in the veterinary profession, including the intersectionality of gender and race.
There is also intersectionality of being female, and, in my case, black. As a recently qualified vet, it turns out I was being offered 8K less than a colleague, with a similar level of experience.
This accusation of illegal employment practice, of discrimination, by a veterinary practice is unprecedented from a president of RCVS. The accusation, it should be noted, is not about the opportunity she had to work, but about the equity of outcome, the salary difference which she perceived to be based on the intersectionality of gender and race. No other context is given, but for identitarian politics, context is irrelevant, perception is everything, particularly if a matter can be reduced to simple, immutable characteristics. It should also be noted that this is an account from the RCVS platform, with all the asymmetry of authority and reach that this has, and no offer to the employer to give their version of events. In summary, Mandisa's contribution to the presidency can be summarized as endorsing authoritarianism and intersectional politics. Where, in those, is our science, and the promotion of animal welfare. Elizabeth Lizzie Lockett. Lizzie Lockett is not a vet or a vet nurse. She is an administrator. She is not a scientist, and therefore has no experience of the scientific method, where argument is refined through challenge, and so, has no need of this methodology. Instead, her background and education is in the humanities, the cultural disciplines which do not enjoy professional recognition, unless deployed as a tool, for instance, in teaching. As a non-professional, she has no experience therefore of personal professional accountability, except second-hand, and by report, from the complaints and disciplinary process that we have, as veterinary surgeons. She has no understanding, or experience, of the meaning in the thousands of everyday interactions that clinical practitioners have with their patients, and the public, as evidenced by her utter lack of recognition, by any means, of general practitioners. She is also the antithesis of change at RCVS, because she has been there since 2005, and has held office as CEO since 2017. Her predecessor moved on, with a positive legacy, after 5 years in post. 2022 is, coincidentally, Liz's 5th year as CEO. One of the administrative tasks devolving to her is writing the RCVS strategy document. She has authored 3, each headlined with different values. It is the Strategic Plan 2017 to 2019, which held the first inkling of her determination to achieve cultural change, not just at RCVS, but within the profession, when she wrote,
Ambition. Enable us to make the UK veterinary professions the best that they can be, into the future.
The same document had a number of other references to achieving cultural change, from the headline values of leadership, innovation, and culture change, to more granular comments like
the pressing need to consider culture change within the profession, to ensure it continues to grow and learn.
This was a particularly perplexing comment, when RCVS had only 2 years before had the reassurance from their own survey that the profession enjoyed 95% public trust, thereby having a very, very small amount left to grow, and where that trust was utterly dependent on competence, the deployment of expertise, and knowledge, or in other words, learning. There was also the curious ambition to
establish the extent to which a blame culture is present within the veterinary and veterinary nursing professions.
When this came from the organization with the statutory power to apportion blame, and, as it has turned out, the organization which has adopted a political viewpoint, focused on identifying structural, collective, and personal dimensions of guilt and blame, based on gender, age, ethnicity, and sexuality. For instance, this was all a bit strange. The tendency to have a skewed view of the profession, and a loose interpretation of the meaning of words, has become another facet of Liz's conduct, particularly as CEO. She has reframed clarity and openness in RCVS administration by increasing the obscurity in council papers. She has produced and enforced codes of behaviour on councillors, and allowed the witch hunt of the whistleblower at RCVS, a great example of how to root out someone to blame. She has also, critically, appointed and reappointed Stonewall as advisors to RCVS on policy. Advertising this move as facilitating diversity and inclusion at RCVS, she is tacitly acknowledging the preeminence of intersectional politics at RCVS, something that did not exist there before her term as CEO. Despite being a co-signatory to the letter to the record, being prepared to accept challenge and debate, she has no record of either. Instead, when faced with challenge, she defaults to denial, and has no record of debate on any challenge, relying on her registrar to handle the awkwardness surrounding Professor Argyle's cancellation, for instance, and always standing behind the president when confronting other professional bodies, for example responding to the negative criticism following the Workforce Summit, from BVA. In her latest strategic plan, she has moved to discussing cultural changes with quasi-religious rhetoric. Thus, we have compassion and courage and confidence as headline values in the latest strategic plan. This language is straight out of the Old Testament, Isaiah, chapter 41, verse 10.
Fear not, for I am with you, be not dismayed, for I am your God, I will strengthen you, I will help you, I will uphold you with my righteous right hand.
Since when did we ask for politics or religion at RCVS, especially from their administrators? How does either further our science or improve animal welfare? Lizzie is also quite impressed with herself. In her address to RCVS at College Day 2022, she announced the acquisition and move to new premises, which hadn't actually happened, because the new premises weren't actually ready, but all the same. She also announced that RCVS had, quote, stayed solvent, unquote, under her stewardship. RCVS is a legal entity, incorporated by statute. It cannot fail financially. RCVS finances have been managed conservatively for decades, long before Lizzie became CEO. Its solvency, its capacity to meet its debts as they fall due, is not in doubt, because of their balance sheet, and it has an income stream largely derived from retention fee payers like us, which has no limitation, no restriction. Any truly commercial enterprise would kill for their cash reserves and subscription income model. So, why should anyone be impressed with this grandstanding? In her 5 years as CEO, Lizzie has overseen the politicization of RCVS, the corruption of meaning of language, the emergence of a new and chilling authoritarianism, and the adoption of a quasi-religious outlook for RCVS and the profession. She has also headed some of the mental health initiatives at RCVS, for which she should be applauded, except that she has gone too far. By adopting the values of intersectionalism, she has platformed grievance politics and the transcendence of victimhood, which only needs to be perceived, rather than real. Thus, when she states, in her latest plan,
there are high levels of stress, anxiety, and depression within the veterinary team, including veterinary nurses and practice managers, and also issues around help-seeking behavior and stigma.
But utterly fails to understand how intersectionality amplifies, through the attention it gives to grievance, these very issues. There is a lingering question over her approach to mental health support. In her plan, it also states,
calls to VetLife helpline have gone up 500% in the last 5 years.
Or to put it another way, during her term as CEO. So, the question is, whilst correlation does not mean causation, has the RCVS, under her politically driven stewardship, actually contributed to this reporting, through fetishization of grievance and victimhood? a summary. There is no publicly available record to explain why the name group believe they have a remit to use the device of intersectional politics to drive culture change in the profession. All of the name group have adopted the language and behaviours of these politics without seeking the agreement of the profession, either as representatives at council or administrators of the income from retention fee payers. Whilst signing up to be willing to receive challenge and debate, they have not engaged in either respect. There are coinciding and consequential changes at RCVS, as they have adopted their political viewpoint, some with dubious moral and ethical values, and some which may even be harmful to individuals, yet there is no obvious accountability to counter the increasingly authoritarian attitudes and behaviours at RCVS. None of their politics is contributing to our common values of our science and improvement of animal welfare. Why should we put up with this? Please use the comments section to add your voice to the debate. From this series of explainer videos, comments will be distilled to create the next chapter in the RCVS series, which can look at whether we want a politicized, authoritarian RCVS, and if so, what those politics should be, and how accountable RCVS should be to the profession in the future. We are all scientists. We are all vets.